Unit 1, Lesson 6, The Napoleonic Era, from 1799 to 1815. The orange on the map represents France, mainland France, and then also the area of Warsaw, which is modern-day Poland, that was occupied by French forces. The blue areas, most of Spain, much of what is now modern-day Italy, and even areas that are modern-day Germany, the Confederation of the Rhine, was dependent upon Napoleon. The yellow, Prussia and Austria, were allied with Napoleon. So what you see between the orange, the yellow, and the blue is most of Central Europe at the time of Napoleon's reign in the early 1800s was controlled either directly or allied with Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte, or Napoleon I, was the first consul and emperor of the French army. As one of the most celebrated persons in the history of the West. He revolutionized military organization and training, sponsored the Napoleonic Code, which became the prototype for later civil law codes, those used throughout most of the Western democracies, including the United States, and reorganized education and established a long living relationship with the papacy in Rome. So he attended military school in France, joined the army of the National Assembly. During the French Revolution, was appointed general of the French army by the Directory, who had taken control in France in 1799. He was seen as a savior of the Republic to help ward off the rebels from conservatives. And over the course of the first year under his leadership, France was able to take back 9,000 square miles of former French territory. This was a massive ego boost for Napoleon himself, but also a boost for French citizens as they saw the Empire of France becoming formidable on the world stage again. So the focus today is we've already talked about the French Revolution, but the focus of this lecture is to talk about how Napoleon himself came to be more like self-important and came to realize his importance over everyone else in France and how he installed himself as an emperor and dictator. So it was November of 1799. Napoleon used his military prestige and successes and popularity amongst the French citizens to overthrow the Directory. The Directory had been in charge of France's governing body since the French Revolution. He did this because he believed the Directory was corrupt and not interested in serving the will of the people. The national legislature itself voted to dissolve the Directory. This gave Napoleon like dictatorial powers as head of the first consul. And so he's installing himself and overthrowing the Directory, overthrowing the governing body in France. So once Napoleon's named the first consul, so November 10th of 1799, the French consulate in place, the ruling, like the ruling parties, the ruling members, were Napoleon Bonaparte, Jean-Jacques Regis de Cambaceres, and Charles Francois Lebrun. Those are the first, second, and third consuls, or the ruling parties of the French consulate. But only 4 years later, in 1804, in a sudden turn of events, Napoleon drafted a new constitution. This was the fourth revised or new constitution in France in an 8 year period. And this new constitution named him the first consul of France for life, unbeknownst to the other consuls. So they were not named in this new constitution as consuls or ruling party members for life. Only Napoleon was. So this was the beginning of the Napoleonic era. So he took power from the Directory, instilled himself as the first council seat, and then proclaimed himself in a new constitution, which he wrote that he would be the first council member for life. How Napoleon became emperor was actually like a three-part plan that he had because he wanted to have the vote of the people confirming him as Emperor of France. And so he did it by a simple yes or no vote on a very specific question. This is similar to how referendums become laws in California today, a yes or no vote. So in 1800, the plebiscites, the peasants, all the citizens of France voted yes on naming Napoleon Bonaparte the first Consul of France. You got to remember, he was their most victorious general ever. He helped restore the glory and empire of France. And so they were happy to vote for him first Consul of France. And he was doing well in those first 2 years. I mean, many of his reforms left a lasting mark on the institution of France and most of Western Europe. So in 1802, they voted yes again to now naming him the first Consul of France for life. And again, he's doing great things. He's expanding education and access. He's revamped French's military and helped with lead a military expansion. And so in 1804, when a third vote comes up, the people vote yes almost unanimously on naming Napoleon the Emperor of France. So Napoleon's coronation takes place December 2nd of 1804. It was held at Notre Dame Cathedral. You'll remember most recently about 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, Notre Dame Cathedral burnt almost completely down. But a little over 200 years ago, Napoleon received his coronation there. He actually took the crown from the Pope and placed it on his head himself. Normally, the Pope from Rome comes and places the crown upon the emperor's head. Napoleon did this himself because he wanted to signal that he felt he was more powerful than the Catholic Church, more powerful than the Pope himself. So by him crowning himself, he was taking away that right and prestige from the papacy, from the Pope. And we'll get into the bad stuff that Napoleon did. We'll get into the wrongs that he enacted on his people, but he did a lot right. He was enlightened. But a lot of his Enlightenment ideas and a lot of the positives that he issued in France were usually, they came with restrictions on individual rights of people. Some of the reform focused, he focused on four major areas: economics, social, religious, and legal reform. Other improvements, he tried to bring order to France after the instability of the revolution. France was in financial turmoil. He really did a good job of turning Paris into a beautiful city with parks and fountains and boulevards, made it one of the most sought after destinations in Europe that still stands to this point today. The economic reform that Napoleon sought. He wanted to slow inflation and equal out taxation. He thought that this would be more balanced and create a stable economy. So he was able to balance the budget in France and help pay down some of their debt that the military had ensued during the revolution and help set up a national bank that would help France go international, in essence, help France continue its expansion. But he was not able to control the circulation of money. And so by not controlling the circulation of money, it led to the inflation coming back. Some of the ways that Napoleon was able to balance the budget was selling the Louisiana Territory in North America to President Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. Sold a large area in North America that encompasses about 6 states now in modern times. Sold it for $15 million. It's about 3 cents per acre. Now, Napoleon and the French didn't want to give up this territory in North America, but they needed the financial resources. They needed the money, basically. And the U.S. was far too eager to purchase this land west of the Mississippi and help establish a larger section of North America for America to expand to. Napoleon saw this as a way to finance his plans in Europe, um, and helped focus his resources in mainland Europe instead of having so many resources tied up thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. Many of the social reforms that Napoleon enacted throughout France centered on the thoughts of equality. He welcomed nobles back into government positions who were on good behavior. He promoted officials by merit, like created a meritocracy, not one based on nobility. So even if you weren't born to a wealthy family, if you were in the government in any position and you were doing well and you were working well, you were promoted throughout the ranks. It wasn't based on who your parents were or your status at birth. He also set up lycees or public schools, which consisted of ordinary children and wealthy children. At least in France, this was unheard of, allowing peasants and workers and the common folks' kids to go to school with the government officials and with the wealthy families. How all the children were treated equally and educated equally. And in those schools, he helped introduce the metric system to France, which allowed them to be more on common ground with the rest of Europe. And one other area of the reforms is the religious reforms that Napoleon sought to enact. One thing is throughout Europe, throughout this time, the Catholic Church was the great authority of all, not just of Rome and of the Vatican. Um, it was the great overseer of Western democracies and Western civilization. Napoleon established an agreement called a concordat with the Pope. This was a new relationship between the Catholic Church and the state of France. It allowed for the freedom of religion. Um, Napoleon himself and the French government promoted Catholicism as a great majority and the true religion of France, but it wasn't the national religion of France. They allowed anybody to worship anything they wanted. This helped eliminate any political control of the Pope and of the Catholic Church on the French citizenry. No longer was it a like religious monarchy, right? He also emancipated the Jews from laws that restricted them to ghettos within France and within French controlled territories. So simultaneously, France is expanding its area throughout Europe, throughout North Africa, and many Jewish people throughout Europe. And so this allowed them in those French controlled territories in France itself to not be relegated to certain ethnic neighborhoods called ghettos. And among the most lasting reforms were the legal reforms that Napoleon brought apart. Bonaparte established. With the Napoleonic Code of Laws, this was a set of 101 new laws that established a strong sense of law and order, and based on reason and logic, that were meant to promote the health, well-being, and safety of all French citizens. But simultaneously, many of the laws placed big limitations on individual freedoms. There was equality under the law. We just talked about freedom of religion. There was freedom of speech and the press, but they were limited. Newspapers were allowed to be published, but they were censored by the government. They reduced women's rights, basically the right to sell property. Women had many other rights and they were treated as equal citizens, but they couldn't unload property that was seen as a male dominated area, male only area. And the Napoleonic Code also restored slavery in the French colonies of the Caribbean, specifically Haiti, because Haiti was dealing with the Haitian Revolution led by Toussaint Louverture. We'll cover that in a couple of weeks when we look at Unit 3. And so, how was Napoleon able to do all of this stuff? Well, he was a military genius, and his driving passion was the military expansion of the French dominion and French domination on the world stage. Um, he was an expert in the use of artillery. He developed innovative artillery strategy that's still in use today. Um, the mobile artillery cannons you see in the pictures here were able to be moved along the lines in any battle and on almost any terrain in the snow just as easily as they would be in a grass field. Napoleon the Conqueror, quickly forcing his way across Europe through brute, hour, and military strategy, both at the Battle of Austerlitz in December of 1805 and the Battle of Jena in 1806, where he invaded Austria and invaded Prussia, and forcing the rulers, both the emperor and the king, to make peace and form an alliance with him. It was then in June of 1807 where Napoleon fought the Russians in Poland, forcing the Tsar Alex I, the leader of Russia, to the bargaining table where they basically split up Europe and Poland. Half of Poland and all of Europe, so to the west, was the territory of Napoleon, became France's territory, and half of Poland and the Ottoman Empire to the east became territory of Russia. So in this, the Tsar Alex I and Emperor Napoleon kind of made an agreement to coexist peacefully and not go to war with one another. Understanding Napoleon on his side that a prolonged war with Russia would drain all of the financial resources and limit the military capability of France. In this, Napoleon appointed several of his brothers to the thrones and helped reestablish, with his coronation, aided by the Pope in the Notre Dame Cathedral in 1804, reestablishing the titles of princes to family members, to brothers. And so he appoints several of his brothers to thrones in Spain and in Holland. And Napoleon himself also held title in Italy as the King of Italy, being crowned in Milan, Italy, somewhere around 1805, 1806. As you can imagine, with all this success, the economic reforms, the political reforms, the social reforms, and the military conquests, Napoleon's ego is just massive. And it actually gets in his way because he has so much success that he becomes blinded by it. And he thinks that everything he does is going to be successful and everything he touches is going to be prosperous. And so it actually causes him to make three fatal mistakes. He's trying to create this continental system. He's attempting to blockade Great Britain from having any influence or any interaction on the European continent, on the mainland. He also goes through the Peninsular War. This is a result of the non-compliance with the continental system. And then he also tries to invade Russia. And again, this is a result of the non-compliance within that continental system. So we'll get into each of those. First off, looking at the continental system. Established in 1806, the goal was to try to make Europe self-sufficient from Great Britain and to help cripple Great Britain. So if France is able to block Great Britain from shipping its goods into Europe and selling them, it's going to cripple the British economy and force them to have to look inwards. And it's also going to help establish French controlled economies and help create like a monetary system based around the French trade and not the British trade. This was a problem because Russia is still selling grain to Great Britain. And since Russia and France, Tsar Alex I and Napoleon have set up sort of a peace agreement and a non-aggression pact, France is having trouble honoring this blockade and this continental system because Russia is still doing business with Great Britain. This eventually leads to the War of 1812, which we'll cover in just a minute. It's this failure of the continental system of Napoleon trying to have mainland Europe fall all under his rule, both militarily and economically, that leads to a peninsular war. So basically, what happens is Portugal is not participating in the continental system. They still want to do business with the British. They want to do business with the growing country that is the United States of America. Um, they want to do their own thing. And so Napoleon sends an army through Spain to attack Portugal for their non-compliance. On their way to Portugal, Spanish guerrillas, this is Spanish nationalists who did not like being under the rule of Napoleon and his brothers, they fight in the name of nationalism. It's a brutal, bloody war between the two, and the Spanish guerrillas were actually aided by Great Britain, who sent not only supplies and money, they also sent soldiers to help aid the Spanish guerrillas. So, end result, Napoleon loses 300,000 men, greatly weakening France's national army, and he never gets Portugal to comply. Not only that, his brother Joseph, Prince Joseph, is exiled. He doesn't get to keep the crown as the King of Spain since they were unsuccessful in their conquest of Portugal, and the Spanish guerrillas, with the help of Great Britain, helped kick Napoleon's soldiers out of not only Portugal, but of Spain. And overlapping slightly with the Peninsular War is the invasion of Russia and the War of 1812. Here, Napoleon's goal was to try to lead a quick 20-day campaign to take Russia as punishment for breaking with the continental system and selling their grain to Great Britain. So Napoleon orders the invasion of Russia, and he invades with a grand army of 600,000 men. Many of these men weren't French nationals, though. They were from the territories, from the other areas that France had acquired through conquest. And so they didn't have high loyalty towards Napoleon to begin with. Um, the French army, this grand army of 600,000 men, was not as adequately supplied with food and water and shelter, and they weren't able to sustain the losses they would find. Although they won at Moscow, Tsar Alex I wouldn't surrender. Winter had began to set in, and although France and many of the French citizens and the French military had experienced cold winters, it was nothing like a winter in Russia, and they couldn't survive. So only 6 months later, in December of 1812, Napoleon is forced to return with only 10,000 men. Started off with an army of 600,000, and now they're down to 10,000 men. This scorched earth policy sucked them in. And Napoleon just kept throwing more and more soldiers at the problem, thinking it would break the logjam with Russia and break their spirits, and it never did. This actually becomes the beginning of the end for Napoleon, the end of his reign as emperor, and the end of his influence throughout Europe. And pretty much that's exactly what happened is the beginning of the end for Napoleon meant that all of his enemies, and he had made a lot of enemies over his time, they had a chance to kick him when he's down. Europe had Napoleon at his weakest, and they all decided to attack. There became this grand alliance of other European countries, Russia, Great Britain, Portugal, Spain, Italy, where they all agreed that they needed to take him out and firmly and finally end this era of conquerors in Europe. Um, Napoleon himself was exiled to Elba, but he did return, and he wanted to come back for one last ride of glory and chance at reaffirming and reestablishing his legacy and the empire that he had built in France. He was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, which is in Belgium, by General Wellington of Great Britain. Now he's exiled even further away to St. Helena, which is in the South Atlantic, under the guard of Great Britain and British troops. There were other inhabitants of the island. I mean, he wasn't like exiled there and marooned there alone, but it wasn't with any members of his family. And Napoleon actually died on the island in 1821, less than a decade later. He's only 51. Cause of his death was never actually determined. Many thought it was stomach cancer or poisoning. A lot of it could have been held to neglect. Um, that's where we're at with Napoleon. So now that Europe has come together, kind of in unison to oust Napoleon from the continent and remove him from any seat of power, what are they going to do? So there's a meeting held in Vienna, Austria, and it's held by the foreign minister of Austria, Clemens von Metternich, and he leads a meeting of major European powers, including Russia and Great Britain, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and they come together with the thought of meeting for 4 weeks. It actually turned into 8 months of meetings, but it was aimed at restoring the order and stability of Europe, creating a Europe that each individual sovereign or independent country would govern itself and not be held under the subjugation of a foreign power or empire. So the foreign minister of Austria, Metternich's agenda for the meeting, his action plan, if you will, was first up to encircle France, to strengthen all the countries around France, Belgium, Poland, and create these independent sovereign countries that could prevent French aggression in the future, to help balance out the power and to, try to restore the balance so no one country in Europe was any more or less a threat to other countries. So no one country had any power over the other countries. And then the odd part is after all these revolutions, the Glorious Revolution in England and the French Revolution and the American Revolution and the revolutions that are happening in Latin America concurrently, they actually wanted to restore the legitimacy of the monarchies that were deposed by Napoleon and uphold these conservative political ideals that weren't radical, that weren't revolutionary. So they kind of wanted to go back to the way it was before a lot of the revolutions. And the way that they sought to do that, again, Russia and Great Britain leading the charge, was to create sort of like a seat of power with the Austrian Empire, comprised of modern day Germany and Austria and Hungary, the Prussian Empire, Russia, Great Britain, and they also wanted to keep France as a great power of Europe, feeling that there was too much history and too much power with the French Navy and French Army, and the citizenry had become too enlightened and too educated to be put under the subjugation of another country. So they wanted France to keep its great sense of power and prestige on the world stage.